What seemed like an ordinary courtroom hearing in a quiet little town took a shocking turn when a single T-shirt bearing a racist message left the entire courtroom stunned. And within minutes, a black judge turned arrogance into a powerful lesson no one would ever forget. Welcome to the channel, where we share real, moving, and powerful stories every single day. If this is your first time watching, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you love stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow so you never miss another journey. Now, let's uncover what really happened inside that courtroom in Stonebridge that day. The air inside courtroom 3 of the Stonebridge County Courthouse was thick with suffocating silence. Every gaze in the room was magnetically drawn to a single point, the spot where Lindsay Hartman stood at the defendant's podium. The pale blue-white glow of the neon lights cast a sterile sheen on her expressionless face, her golden hair cascading lightly over her shoulders. But it was what she wore that had frozen the entire room, a plain white T-shirt with bold, black letters screaming, F** black people. A gasp erupted from the gallery. A black security officer tightened his grip on the holster at his hip. A woman in the back row raised her hand to her mouth, as if she'd just witnessed a brutal accident. And at the very center of it all, seated high above on the bench, was Judge Elias Rowe, a black man with composed face, steel gray close-cropped hair, and eyes that had yet to blink. Rowe had once served as a military prosecutor, staring down war criminals without flinching, but never, in his 18 years on the bench, had he encountered a defendant who walked so brazenly into a courtroom, a hall of justice, wearing hate like a badge of honor. "Ms. Hartman," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the air like a blade. Approached the bench. Lindsay smirked. She strode forward with the arrogant swagger of someone who had never known consequences. Her chin was tilted upward in defiance. The morning's memories, burning a half-smoked Marlboro over a lazy breakfast with her slacker boyfriend, still clung to her posture like smoke. To Lindsay, this was nothing but a joke of a court hearing. The shirt? Just a way to make a point. But to Judge Rowe, it was a declaration of war against the very idea of justice. He removed his glasses, set them on the walnut desk in front of him, and folded his hands, eyes locked onto hers. "I had originally intended to handle your case with leniency, rehabilitation, supervised probation, and perhaps some mandatory civics education," he said, his tone calm but cold. "But after how you walked in here this morning, I've been forced to reconsider." A ripple of tension swept through the courtroom. A few members of the public pulled out their phones, recording. The court clerk lifted her head, eyes wide with disbelief. Judge Rowe gave a subtle nod to the black bailiff, standing at the back, locked the doors. The metallic click that followed sounded final, like the slamming of a gavel. Rowe sat upright. He looked at Lindsay not as a defendant, but as a contagion that needed to be quarantined from society. "Ms. Hartman," he said, his voice low and heavy like a stone, "you will not be leaving this courtroom the same way you entered." Stonebridge, a small town in Georgia where power doesn't just reside in government offices, but in every handshake, every private phone call. Lindsay Hartman was born and raised here, the daughter of Police Chief Scott Hartman and niece of Judge Roy Hartman, who sat on the Southern District Appellate Court for nearly 3 decades. In all of her 26 years, Lindsay had never truly faced consequences, and that bred a dangerous belief that she was untouchable. Her most recent arrest? Drunk and disorderly in the parking lot of a bar. The victim, a black woman named Renee Marshall, a nurse and single mother on her way to a night shift. The reason? Renee had looked at her funny as Lindsay sped recklessly out of the lot. She gave me that stare like I was the one doing something wrong, Lindsay had said, exhaling cigarette smoke out her car window as if recounting a story about the wrong coffee order. I just nudged her shoulder. "Okay, maybe a little hard, but come on." It was one shove. Dylan, her boyfriend, disheveled and half engaged, shrugged without looking up from his phone. "Yeah, whatever. Your dad's got it." And Lindsay believed that, without question, she had walked away from 3 DUIs, 1 public disturbance charge, and a petty theft accusation from a grocery store, all vanished before ever reaching a prosecutor's desk. In Lindsay's eyes, the law was a dull process meant for common people. Her? She was a Hartman, and in Stonebridge, that name might as well have been a license to ignore accountability. So when the court summons arrived for the assault on Renee, Lindsay didn't break a sweat. She even laughed. On the drive to court, she told her friend Trevor, worst case, a few hours of community service. They wouldn't dare touch me. What Lindsay never expected, what she never could have imagined, was that the man behind the bench that day wouldn't be a soft-spoken, predictable old judge, but Judge Elias Rowe, a black man whose eyes seemed to cut through the polished lies of the world. Lindsay had heard of him, strict, unshakable, immune to pressure, even from the most powerful families in town. But instead of fearing him, Lindsay felt entertained. She had always looked down on black authority figures, and to her, the name Elias Rowe was nothing but a new game, a new toy to provoke. I'm going to make sure he never forgets this hearing, she told Dylan with a smirk of entitlement and mischief, the kind worn by someone who had never paid for anything, except in cash. The racist t-shirt wasn't a careless accident. She chose it on purpose, to provoke, to insult, to flaunt her perceived immunity, to say without words, I'm still above the law. What she didn't know was at this time, that shirt would be her first sentence. Back inside courtroom 3, silence still cloaked the room after the doors had locked. Lindsay Hartman stood with arms crossed, leaning against the defendant's podium as if she were at a dinner party instead of a criminal proceeding. That same smug expression rested on her face, the expression that carried her through scandal after scandal, untouched and unscathed. But Judge Elias Rowe wasn't in a hurry. He calmly removed his glasses and placed them on the polished mahogany bench. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows behind him cast a long, solemn shadow, making him appear like a monument standing at the border between justice and arrogance. Ms. Hartman, he began, his voice steady and resonant. The original recommendation from the prosecution was 12 months of probation, mandatory behavioral counseling, and a public apology to the victim. Lindsay rolled her eyes and smirked. Told you I'd be out in no time. She turned toward Dylan, her boyfriend seated in the gallery, and winked like someone already celebrating a win. Elias didn't flinch. He looked down at the case file, his fingers lightly turning the pages, as if he were double-checking something. Then he gave a small nod, like someone who had arrived at a final, unshakable conclusion. However, he continued, lifting his gaze to meet hers, you have transformed this hearing into something far beyond legal procedure. You made it a stage to challenge the very foundation of the system, with your attitude, your words, and your wardrobe. And as the one entrusted with the scales of justice in this courtroom, I cannot ignore that. Lindsay raised an eyebrow, her mouth parting in disbelief. Pursuant to the authority vested in me by the Stonebridge County Court, Elias said firmly, I am modifying your sentence. You will not receive probation. Instead, you will serve 90 days in custody at the Stonebridge County Detention Center. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the courtroom. In addition, Elias said louder, cutting to the buzz of disbelief, you're ordered to complete a racial awareness rehabilitation program, perform at least 120 hours of community service, and write a 3,000-word essay on the societal impact of hate speech. This essay will be published on the official website of this court. The soft flurry of phones clicking to record echoed from the back rows. Some were filming, some were already live streaming. Lindsay slammed her hand on the table and shot to her feet, sending the chair behind her clattering to the floor. I'm not going to jail over a t-shirt. You can't do this. You don't have the authority. I believe, Elias replied coolly, this is a matter of choice, and I am choosing to revise the sentence to match your behavior. She whipped around to her attorney, a silver-haired man whose face had gone pale the moment Elias began reading the verdict. Do you owe something? My dad will sue him to the ground. He's Police Chief Scott Hartman, remember? The lawyer only bowed his head and murmured, I warned you. Elias remained perfectly still. His gaze didn't waver from Lindsay. Just then, a young woman entered the courtroom and handed a small USB drive to the court clerk. She whispered something to him, and the clerk nodded. Elias turned his gaze toward them. Clerk, please read the contents of the new evidence. The clerk flipped through his notes and read aloud, voice crisp and clear. Surveillance footage from Dandy's gas station. dated April 12th, confirms that the defendant, Lindsay Hartman, verbally assaulted the victim, Renee Marshall, with racial slurs prior to initiating physical contact. A weary sigh echoed from the gallery. Elias looked at Lindsay one last time. This court now renders judgment. Ms. Hartman, he said slowly, you have the right to appeal. However, in the meantime, this sentence is to be enforced immediately. Bullshit. Lindsay screamed, yanking her arm as a court officer approached. I'm calling my uncle, Judge Roy Hartman, and he's going to bench you. I swear. A camera shutter snapped from the press row. Elias said nothing more. He simply gave a look, a subtle nod. Two security officers stepped forward and, without a word, handcuffed Lindsay as camera lights flashed and murmurs rippled across the courtroom. As she was led away, Lindsay continued to thrash. You'll regret this. I'll sue you. I'll sue this whole corrupt system. Bastards. And in that exact moment, Elias's calm stare, Lindsay's screaming figure lit up by camera flashes. It became a symbol, a mirror held up to the face of a biased legal system, and a rare moment when justice spoke with unmistakable clarity. Outside, news outlets began to flood the airwaves. The story of the outrageous courtroom drama of an arrogant white woman sentenced by a stern black judge spread across the country. And perhaps, for the first time in her life, Lindsay Hartman began to understand. Not everyone bowed to the Hartman name. At Stonebridge County Jail, Lindsay Hartman never imagined she'd be standing here, in a cold room, walls lined with dull gray concrete, a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. Stripped bare in every sense of the word. Strip, ordered the female correctional officer, her voice flat, needing no repetition. Lindsay froze, hands trembling. She wanted to resist, to say something like, my father is a sheriff, but the hollow, uninterested stare of the officer made her swallow those words. In here, they didn't care who her father was. The infamous T-shirt was pulled off for the last time and tossed into a stainless steel trash bin, its fall sharp and final, like a stripped symbol of privilege. Then came the body inspection, clinical, cold, and humiliating. Lindsay had never felt so small. Turn left. Raise your arms. Squat and cough. Once the processing was done, they tossed Lindsay a crumpled orange jumpsuit, a pair of plastic sandals, and a paper-thin blanket. Welcome to Stonebridge, the correctional officer said, as if checking in a hotel guest. She was escorted down a narrow hallway, the dragging sound of her sandals echoing like the sighs of those who had entered but never truly left. Eyes from behind cell doors scanned her like x-rays, cold, disdainful, and at times, hungry. A whistle cut through the air. Look who's here, Barbie just checked in, a female voice jeered. Lindsay lowered her head, heart pounding. She hadn't expected power to vanish this fast. Just yesterday, she had stood smug in a courtroom. Today, she was just one of hundreds of inmates, and easily the most vulnerable. Cell G14, the guard said, pulling open the steel door. In you go. Lindsay stepped in, clutching the blanket to her chest, eyes avoiding contact. But then, from the left bunk, a woman looked up. She closed her book slowly, set it down, and rose to her feet. Lindsay froze. That face, the deep brown eyes, the cheekbones still faintly bruised, was unmistakable. Renee Marshall, the very woman she had insulted, shoved, and punched at the gas station, for no other reason than a supposed dirty look. Well, this just got interesting, Renee said, folding her arms, tilting her head. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut like a thin blade. Fate sure knows how to pick its moments, huh, Barbie? Lindsay stood stiff. She wanted to step back, but the cold concrete wall offered no escape. Here's how it works, Renee continued, walking slowly toward her. I don't care who you were out there. In here, everyone starts with a number on their shirt and their attitude. Lindsay swallowed hard, trying to sound tough. I've got nothing to say to you. Well, good thing I got 3 months to watch and listen, Renee said with a half smile, then turned back to her bunk. The blanket slipped from Lindsay's arms to the floor, and in that cramped 9-square-meter cell, for the first time, she realized what it meant to be imprisoned, not just by walls, but by her own past. In the early days at Stonebridge County Jail, Georgia, Lindsay Hartman, once a 26-year-old wrapped in luxury, began to feel the unrelenting weight of life behind bars. Gone were the lavish parties, the shield of her powerful family. She now faced the brutal realities of incarceration. From day one, Lindsay became a target. The inmates hadn't forgotten the t-shirt she'd worn in court. The mockery, the disdainful stares, the sudden blows, they became routine. She tried to maintain a facade of pride, but the bruises told a different story. The world she'd once known was gone. One evening, cornered by a group of inmates ready to unleash a beating, Lindsay found herself utterly defenseless until Renee Marshall appeared. Strong, calm, unflinching, Renee stepped in. She shoved the others back and pulled Lindsay out of danger. Lindsay couldn't believe it. The woman she had once degraded and attacked was now protecting her. The contradiction stunned her, throwing her into an emotional tailspin. From sworn enemy to unexpected protector, Renee Marshall became Lindsay's only shield inside those prison walls. However, Renee's protection didn't come free. She laid down the rules. Lindsay had to follow the prison code, learn to respect others, and let go of her arrogance. Though reluctant at first, Lindsay slowly began to change. She learned how to listen, how to coexist, and gradually began to understand the daily struggles faced by women like Renee. Their relationship grew more complex over time. From enemies, they became reluctant companions, facing the challenges of incarceration together. Lindsay started to feel warm from the very people she used to look down on. She realized that to survive and to grow, she would have to let go of her ego and learn how to care. One evening, during a quiet conversation, Renee opened up about her past, the injustices she endured simply because of the color of her skin. Lindsay listened, really listened, and for the first time in her life, she truly felt someone else's pain. Her transformation was no longer forced. It was an awakening from deep within her heart. In the days that followed, Lindsay was no longer the arrogant girl she'd once been. She became someone who could empathize and support. She began to take part in rehabilitation activities, help fellow inmates, and gradually found a new sense of purpose. The bond between Lindsay and Renee became a symbol of reconciliation and change. In a place thought to be filled only with pain and resentment, they discovered friendship and hope. Their story spread across the facility, becoming a source of quiet inspiration for many. After the early struggles of adapting to life inside Stonebridge County Jail, Georgia, Lindsay Hartman slowly found her rhythm. Her relationship with Renee Marshall, the black woman she had once attacked, grew deeper. From enemies, they evolved into allies, facing the realities of prison life side by side. One late afternoon, Lindsay was called to the warden's office for her scheduled phone call. She picked up the receiver and dialed her father, Sheriff Scott Hartman, hoping he'd find a way to pull her out of this nightmare. Lindsay held the phone tightly. The moment she heard the familiar hello, on the other end, tears welled up instantly. "Dad, it's me. I need you. You have to get me out of here. I can't take it anymore." There was a pause. Then Sheriff Scott Hartman's voice came through, no longer the commanding voice of a county sheriff, but that of a conflicted father. "Lindsay, you know this isn't simple. The media's everywhere. That shirt you wore, it's dragging the entire department into an investigation. I was joking. You always fix things for me. You said I was your whole world." "I did," he interrupted. "I've covered for you your whole life. Wiped reports, made calls, pulled strings so you wouldn't face consequences. But this time is different." "Different how?" There was a long silence, then a heavy sigh. "This time, the whole country's watching. And you cross a line. If I cover for you now, I won't just lose my badge. I'll lose everything." Lindsay was speechless. Her heart felt like it was being crushed. "You need to take responsibility, Lindsay. Sometimes loving someone means letting them face the consequences," her father said. Then came the cold, final click of the call ending. Lindsay stood frozen, tears spilling from her eyes. She had never imagined the day would come when her father refused to help her. Her familiar world collapsed in an instant. She returned to her cell in silence, her eyes vacant. Renee noticed a lost expression on Lindsay's face and walked over. "What happened?" Renee asked. "My dad," He refused to help me, Lindsay whispered. Renee placed a hand on her shoulder, her eyes filled with empathy. Sometimes we have to face the consequences of our actions, but that doesn't mean we can't change. Lindsay nodded, tears streaking down her cheeks. She realized that real change had to begin within herself. After that crushing phone call with her father, Lindsay Hartman sank into a deep sense of abandonment. She realized that in Stonebridge County Jail, there was no one left to rely on but herself. One sweltering afternoon in the jail's dining hall, Lindsay stood in line, aluminum tray in hand, scanning the room for the safest place to sit. But then she froze. Behind the glass partition of the kitchen area, a familiar face appeared. Messy blonde hair, a crooked smile that once made her heart race in high school. Dylan Reeves. They had once been an untouchable couple in Stonebridge, the sheriff's daughter and the son of a well-connected local businessman. But while Lindsay had been detained for her assault on Renee, Dylan had been arrested for illegal possession of firearms. Guns he kept in his trunk to impress his friends. Lindsay had ended the relationship abruptly. She didn't want to be associated with trash, as she'd coldly written in a text. Now, that same trash stood just a few feet away, wearing a gray inmate uniform, gloved hands serving soup to other prisoners like it was his fate all along. Dylan caught her gaze. For a moment he was stunned. Then he set down the ladle, removed his gloves, and made his way around the line to approach her. He spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "Lindsay, you're not safe here. Trust me, this place isn't like the world you used to live in." She narrowed her eyes, cautious. "What are you doing here?" 3-year sentence, he said, eyes locked on hers. "I chose a different path to survive. Aryan Brotherhood. I'm not proud of it, but at least it kept me alive." Lindsay froze. She knew exactly what the Aryan Brotherhood was, a violent, extremist gang notorious for racial hatred and brutality. Joining meant pledging loyalty through brutal acts. "You should think about it," Dylan continued, voice low. "If you want to protect yourself and maybe get your sentence reduced, this is your only real option." That night, Lindsay lay awake, thoughts racing. She remembered the attacks, the scornful stares, the helplessness of having no one to defend her. But she also remembered Renee Marshall, the black woman she had once assaulted, who stepped in when she was being ambushed and showed her how to survive behind bars. The next morning, Lindsay made her decision. She turned down Dylan's offer. She knew joining the gang would mean losing herself and betraying everything she was slowly learning to value again. But that choice came with a price. A week later, Lindsay was ambushed in the showers. Beaten badly, she was taken to the prison infirmary. When she returned to the general population, she walked slowly, still sore from the slow recovery. The bruises on her body had faded, but the fight inside her was far from over. Something had shifted after she rejected Dylan Reeves' offer. Rather than compromise with the Aryan Brotherhood, Lindsay chose to stand alone, even if it meant blood and isolation. Even Dylan, her ex-boyfriend, once a familiar source of comfort, had become a symbol of everything she now sought to leave behind. After her firm rejection, Dylan arranged for the gang to attack her, a warning. But instead of breaking her, it led to an internal investigation. During a surprise search, officers discovered hidden letters between Dylan and gang members. He was transferred to another facility and now faced charges for organizing violence inside prison. His path of reoffending had slammed shut behind him. For Lindsay, the only steady thing keeping her grounded was the quiet, unwavering presence of Renee Marshall. In the darkest days, when everyone else turned away, Renee stayed close. She handed her food tray, left a water bottle on her bed. No questions, no demands, just silent patience. Something Lindsay had never known, especially from someone she had once hurt. One late evening, in the prison yard, Lindsay spotted Renee jogging laps. She approached her, slowly but with purpose. "You knew I turned down Dylan's offer, didn't you?" Lindsay asked, her voice raw. Renee stopped, wiping sweat from her brow with the sleeve of her prison uniform. "I knew. You're not afraid they'll come after me again or drag you into it too?" "Of course," Renee shrugged. "But if people like us bow our heads every time we're threatened, they'll never stop. Lindsay looked down. "Thank you." Renee studied her for a long moment. "I'm not here to forgive. I'm here to live right. If you want real change, you got to start with how you treat others and how you treat yourself." She continued, "You chose a harder path, but it's the right one. You're not alone." From then on, Lindsay and Renee became close friends. They participated in rehabilitation programs together, helped other inmates, and slowly built a small community inside the prison. One built on mutual respect and support. Lindsay began journaling every day and sharing her entries with fellow inmates during group therapy. In one session, she read an opening line that silenced the entire room. "I used to think I was untouchable, but when I lost everything, I learned what was worth keeping most: dignity." Lindsay learned to face her past, accept her wrongdoings, and strive to become a better person. She realized that true strength didn't come from violence or power, but from the courage to change and the resolve to stand for what is right. The 3,000-word essay she had once written begrudgingly as part of her sentence eventually turned into a heartfelt confession. It was published on the court's website and quickly went viral on social media, not as a required apology, but as a raw warning from someone who had once walked arrogantly and now learned to bow in order to rise again. 3 days later, during a mandatory rehabilitation meeting, Lindsay sat quietly as a female officer read aloud the latest news report. The state's Judicial Council has launched an internal investigation into unusual rulings connected to the Hartman family, including Judge Roy Hartman and Sheriff Scott Hartman. The probe is believed to involve decades of potentially biased legal decisions. The news didn't bring Lindsay satisfaction, only clarity. The system she once believed would always protect her had been rotten at the core. On her final night before release, Lindsay sat alone in her cell. Renee walked in and placed a small book in front of her, Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. "Read it," Renee said, "not to become someone else. Just to remember, sometimes the first step toward change is learning how to be still and listen." The next morning, the prison gates opened. Lindsay stepped outside, not as a pampered blonde once shielded by power, but as a quiet figure bearing the calm face of someone who had fallen to the bottom and climbed her way back up, scarred but standing. Lindsay Hartman's story didn't end in glory, but it was her refusal to compromise, her decision to take full responsibility, no matter the cost, that made her a living testament. That change is real, but it only comes to those brave enough to confront themselves. Final message. Lindsay Hartman didn't end her journey with triumph, but with awakening. She didn't become a hero, but at least she was no longer someone who believed the law didn't apply to her. And sometimes that's the first step we need, not just to change a person, but to begin changing society.